Welcome to the East Asia by Rhoads Murphey chapter summary podcast at the Historian's Eye. Please subscribe, and if you'd like to be notified when new episodes appear, click the bell icon. Chapter 9, Early Korea, another version of the Chinese pattern. Section 1, the Korean tradition. The Korean peninsula had already developed its own culture and had its own history before coming into contact with and eventually becoming ruled by China. The name Korea comes from the Goryeo Kingdom, which long dominated the peninsula. From the Han Dynasty on, China became interested in Korea, and much of early Korean history comes from Chinese sources. While heavily influenced by elite Chinese culture, Korea maintained important cultural patterns unique to its own region. Chosun, the traditional name for Korea, had its own state as early as the first millennia BCE. Its capital was Pyongyang. Bronze appears in tombs from 800 BCE and iron and copper coins from the 400s BCE. It appears that a Chinese-style government was already established in Korea well before Han conquest in 108 BCE. These developments were based on the previous transferring of bronze, agriculture, and iron tools from China. Chinese accounts of Koreans during the Han period describe the people as being down-to-earth, direct, spontaneous, and even vulgar in comparison to the restrained, proper behavior of the Chinese elite. Korea adopted Confucianism, but it also held on to its unique folk religion. Hereditary privilege and the dominance of an aristocracy inherited by birth remain the basis of Korean government and culture long past the Qin dynasty, which abolished this social practice in China. Korea also maintained the social practice of matrilocal marriage, an inheritance of both male and female children until the 16th century during the Yi dynasty, from 1392 to 1910. Food, clothing, and homes remained Korean in design and varied greatly from Chinese styles. Dance, including the use of masks and syncopated music, remained far more important to Korean culture than it ever became in China. Shamans were prominent and still exist in some areas. Origins. The Korean people probably came from the north-central area via Manchuria. Geographically, Korea is a peninsula located northeast of mainland China. Much of Korea is mountainous, with only 18% of the land in cultivation today. The mountains led to fragmentation that kept the peninsula economically and politically divided until relatively late. The country is physically larger than Britain, but of course much smaller than the massive expanse of the Chinese Empire. Korea's physical makeup differs greatly from China, not only in size, but also because of the predominance of mountains. A central mountain range runs down the center of the country. The mountainous landscape fragmented the country economically and politically. Communication with China and Japan occurred primarily via coastal borders. Early Korea. Little archaeological or historical evidence exists regarding the first Koreans. Early Korea was a tribal culture shaped by fishing, hunting, and gathering. They also produced technically advanced pottery, and after the adoption of agriculture, they built large-scale above-ground tombs. About 200 BCE, millet-based agriculture and domesticated animals spread from China into northern Korea. Less strong evidence suggests the possibility of agricultural cultivation near Seoul as early as 5000 BCE. Around 1100 BCE, rice and bronze spread to the country from China along with refugees escaping the collapse of the Shang dynasty. Korean traditions include stories about the establishment of the first Korean state, Chosun, its founding to 2333 BCE. By the 3rd century BCE, Korea had adopted Chinese iron technology. Han conquest and after. Around 194 BCE, an unsuccessful Han rebel, Wei Man, escaped to Korea and took over the existing state of Chosun. He set up a Sinicized government which controlled the northern half of the country. Wei Man employed existing Korean officials, supported native Korean traditions, but also introduced an iron industry, providing the government with a strong economic and military advantage. The Han Emperor Wudi conquered the Korean state of Chosun during his expansionist campaigns of 109 through 108 BCE. China incorporated the northern two-thirds of the country into its empire and set up military garrisons and permanent Chinese settlements. The Han dynasty collapsed in 220 CE, but Chinese occupation continued into the 4th century until Koreans took control of the leftover colonies. From this time on, Korea maintained an independent state, or group of competing rival states, although it continued to be influenced by successive Chinese dynasties and their culture. 2 Chinese commanderies were established, at Lilong and Daifang. Select families of Chinese descent appeared to have retained important roles in Korean government and society. For some time, Chinese families held on in former Chinese garrisons. By the 300 CE, however, these vestiges of Chinese rule were gone. The 3 kingdoms. After the collapse of Han rule, 3 competing kingdoms emerged in Korea: Goguryeo in the north, Pakje in the southwest, and Shilla in the southeast. Goguryeo began as a confederation of 5 tribes, dominating the mountainous regions bordering Manchuria. These mounted raids including attacks on Chinese who settled in Korea. They were pivotal in challenging Han control of Korea. Their society was hierarchical and governed by aristocratic warriors. Goguryeo rulers collected taxes in kind. In 372 CE, the Goguryeo king, Sosoren, introduced Buddhism as the state religion and set up a national academy to train officials through the philosophy of Confucianism. The south was divided into 3 tribal groups. Ancestors of Goguryeo had migrated into the southern region, and a rival kingdom emerged called Pakje in the southwest. The Shilla kingdom developed across the mountain range to the southeast. Another tribal group, the League of Kaya, with close ties to Japan, also grew along the southern coast, but it never really displayed the ability to become a contender among the other rival states. The 3 rivaling kingdoms all attempted to form alliances with China in the hopes of strengthening their chances of victory. Goguryeo even accepted tributary status with northern and southern Chinese regimes. These connections assisted the further spread of Chinese influence and culture into Korea, including the introduction of Chinese written language. Chinese refugees fleeing the chaotic period following the fall of the Han dynasty arrived in Korea. It is important to note that the written documents in existence about Korea are Chinese until the 1100s. Goguryeo attempt to use Chinese support against its rivals furthered the adoption of Chinese customs. The Goguryeo capital was moved to Pyongyang in 427, the site of the former Han commandery at Lilong. Goguryeo also developed a Chinese-style code of laws for its kingdom and slowly adopted a Chinese-style government with corvée labor, agricultural taxes, military garrisons, and a bureaucratic system. The kingdom of Pakje had developed connections with China by sea and started incorporating Buddhism and the Chinese written language by the late 300s. Rivalry. Shilla maintained rather isolated, but did send an emissary to China in 381. Goguryeo tried to expand its empire southwards, and conflict emerged with Pakje. Pakje forced Goguryeo forces out of the southern areas in 369, and then went on to invade the north. They killed the Goguryeo king in 371. Pakje's strength lay in its control of the most agriculturally productive land in Korea, but it never succeeded in becoming as well organized or as militarily effective as Goguryeo. Pakje made alliances with Shilla and also the Kaya, but the Goguryeo evidently overtook the southwest and continued to push Pakje further southward, forcing them to relocate their capital further south twice. Shilla, located in the southeast, was less advanced than its 2 rivals and more isolated from Chinese influence. It struggled to compete with the wealthy and larger size of the other 2 kingdoms, but its strength lay in its retaining of a traditional tribal aristocratic government. In the 6th century, the Shilla Confederation of Tribes developed into a more unified monarchy. King Papong, from 514 to 539, declared Buddhism the official religion, and Shilla began to slowly adopt a Chinese-style bureaucracy, further strengthening it. Shilla created 17 grades known as bone ranks within the government bureaucracy. These ranks were all based on hereditary aristocracy. The military, which was made up of aristocratic warriors, or flower youth, rather than being primarily peasants as in China. In the mid-6th century, the allied Shilla and Pakche succeeded against Goguryeo. Shilla then took on Pakche and Kaya. At about the same time, the Sui dynasty in China made 3 successive attempts to conquer Korea and failed, contributing to the fall of the dynasty in China. The Tang also attempted to regain Korea as a Chinese territory. When it failed, the Tang made an alliance with Shilla and sent a large army to Korea's southwest coast in 660. The alliance destroyed Pakche and its Japanese allies. Shilla victory. With Pakche destroyed, Shilla and Tang armies moved northward and attacked Goguryeo, which collapsed in 668. The Tang, who still hoped to incorporate China into its empire, turned on Shilla. Shilla succeeded in unifying and organizing its newly conquered population, all of whom opposed potential Chinese rule against the Tang. Conflict lasted about a decade. Shilla pushed the Tang north of Pyongyang to the frontier areas, and the Chinese settled for tributary status. Since a victory over the Tang, Korea has more or less maintained its status as an independent, unified state. Unification and tribute status further contributed to the spread of Chinese culture into Korea. Refugees from the destruction of the Goguryeo in 706 founded the Parhe in northern Manchuria. The state was thoroughly Sinicized. It was taken over with the rise of the Khitan Empire. The area is still considered part of Korean culture. Shilla followed the Chinese pattern of government and divided the country into provinces, prefectures, and counties. The original Shilla capital of Gyeongju remained the primary seat of government, but due to its location, 6 subsidiary capitals were created to help govern the newly unified country. As Shilla restructured the government along the lines of the Chinese model, it firmly held onto the traditional Korean hereditary system. All officials remained members of the aristocracy, even though by 788 the passing of an examination system based on Confucian classics was required. Because of Korea's rigid social system and relatively less productive agricultural system, peasants found few opportunities to improve their quality of life and did not benefit from the new wealth and prosperity achieved by the aristocracy. Mahayana Buddhism spread into Korea from China and became very influential. In its 2nd century of rule, Shilla began to collapse. The bone ranks split into conflicting groups. Rebellions emerged and the capital city was destroyed several times in violence. Peasants fled from estates and became bandits. The Shilla king was killed in 780, and most of the 20 succeeding kings were also assassinated. Goguryeo. Revolts against Shilla were fought by the impoverished peasantry. They were primarily led by ambitious aristocrats, but sometimes from members of the rising merchant class. Also, the Shilla government further weakened. The old rival kingdoms of Pakche and Goguryeo re-emerged. The Tang dynasty in China collapsed, leaving its country in turmoil and incapable of providing aid to Shilla or the other kingdoms. By 935, a former merchant named Wang Kong, who had taken control of the new Goguryeo kingdom, succeeded in eliminating other competing kingdoms and conquering the entire country. He named the new state Goryeo, derived from Goguryeo, which is the origin of the modern name Korea. Under the leadership of Wang Kong, named Taizhou after his death, Goryeo further adopted Chinese culture and style of governance. The capital was moved to Kaesong because it was closer to the most agriculturally productive region of the country. The capital was built according to the Tang checkerboard pattern. The former capitals of Pyongyang and Gyeongju were also subsidiary capitals. A Chinese-style administration, complete with an examination system, and government schools to teach Confucian text was implemented. The growing Khitan menace was dealt with in 1018, when the Third Khitan invasion was defeated. The Jurchen advance eventually eliminated the Khitan threat. However, entrance into the schools and eligibility for taking the examinations remained dominated by the hereditary aristocracy. Also, positions of the highest rank were made by appointment, not through the exam system. As in China, over time, the wealthy landed aristocracy avoided taxation, weakening the government. The non-aristocracy lived as peasant farmers or worked in government-operated mines or porcelain factories. Merchants lost their earlier prominence and past political influence. Most trade occurred by barter since the majority of the country's wealth was limited to the aristocracy around the capital, while the majority of the country remained rural and poor. Both the upper and lower classes were divided into kinship units, and all relationships were labeled in terms of family connection. Aristocratic families used their connection to improve their status and wealth, often in competition with each other. Movable type and woodblock printing allowed for the production of Buddhist themes, including the large-scale printing of the Buddhist Tripitaka in the 11th century and its reprinting in the 13th century. Buddhist revivals included traditional shamanistic rituals. Chan Buddhism, known as Son Buddhism in Korea, was brought into the country from China and attracted followers with its mysticism and emphasis on contemplation. It mixed the elements from traditional Korean shamanism, Taoism, Tian Tai sect, and Zen. Buddhism remained important to Korean culture and peaked during the Koryo period. Buddhism monasteries were centers for art and learning. As the popularity of Buddhism declined in China, its favor also waned in Korea, and religion became increasingly a mix of early Korean traditions, Taoism, and some ritual elements of Buddhism. Landscape painting, porcelain production, and production of historical texts all occurred during the Koryo period, often along the Chinese pattern. Kim Pusik, a scholar official, wrote the first existing history of Korea in 1145. It was called the History of the Three Kingdoms. The role of merchants, high in the time of Taizhou, dwindled along with commerce. In the 1100s, a military aristocracy came to hold most of the power in Korea, shortly before the Mongol conquest, under pressure from Koryo's northern neighbors. Kaesong, the Koryo capital, was plagued by palace wars and assassination of kings. Political and economic instability led to civil war and rebellion, which was successfully subdued by the Zhou family and their private army. Mongol conquest and after. The Mongols invaded Koryo and took the capital in 1231. Korea agreed to pay a heavy tribute and accepted Mongol garrisons as well as provincial governors. The new system was heavily resented and led to widespread guerrilla warfare, which lasted into the 1270s. The Mongols reacted harshly. For example, in the year 1254, the Mongols took over 200,000 Koreans captive as slave labor. Korea was also forced into building up a naval power commanded by the Mongols for expeditions into Japan. The Koryo court had fled to an island off the west coast of the country for protection. They formally surrendered in 1259, but guerrilla fighting continued. Mongol rule lasted from the 1230s to the 1340s and led to the further impoverishment of Korea through harsh rule. The Mongols used the Koryo dynasty to enforce its control over the country. Anti-Mongol Chinese forces entered Korea and briefly captured the capital in 1361. When the new Ming dynasty was established in 1368, the Koryo court disagreed whether or not it should maintain the inherited Mongol system or form an alliance with the Ming. Koryo forces were sent against the Ming army located along the northwest frontier in 1388. Yi Songyi, the general in charge, arrived at the front and evaluated the strength of the Ming army. He decided that it was foolish to attempt resistance and retreated to the capital. Once in Kaesong, he took control of the Koryo government by 1392 and founded the Yi dynasty, ruling over Chosun. Chosun under the Yi dynasty. General Yi quickly made tributary agreements with the Ming dynasty. The dynasty remained in power until 1910. The Yi were loyal to China and eager to superimpose the Chinese model of civilization onto elite Korean culture. The renewed emphasis on Neo-Confucianism in China during the Ming Dynasty was mirrored by the Qing Dynasty in Korea. Some historians argue that in some ways Korea became more entrenched in Confucianism than even China. Further development of the examination system based on the Confucian classics occurred during this period. Decline in the popularity of Buddhism occurred and the state confiscated monastery land and wealth. Yi Song-gi made large land grants to his supporters, leading to the development of a new aristocracy, and eventually to loss of revenue in the case of tax-free land grants. There is an emphasis on education, including the spread of private primary schools, upper-level public provincial schools, and a senior institution at the capital, and a national university. Yi discarded the remaining traditional Korean matriarchal practices in favor of Confucian-sanctioned male dominance. As in China, the Confucian revival is accompanied by a vigorous scholarship and publication of encyclopedias, geographies, medical compendia, and history. The government publishes educational pamphlets like the 1430 Practical Advice for Farmers. Other works include The History of Koryo in 1451 and The Complete Mirror of the Eastern Country in 1484. Kim Chonjik, an important Korean Neo-Confucian scholar, is given credit for developing Korea's rigid version of the philosophy based on the Neo-Confucian school of Jusi. General Yi abdicated in 1398 and was given the posthumous title of Taijo, or Grand Progenitor. Taizong, his son, succeeded and ruled from 1400 to 1418. Then his son, Sejong, ruled from 1418 to 1450. The first three rulers of the Yi dynasty were capable of providing the dynasty with a strong foundation during its first century. They worked to establish a well-organized and efficient Chinese style of government. The capital was moved to Seoul. The country was organized into 8 provinces, then prefectures and local districts. They also adopted a censorate. They adopted the Ming Criminal Code, and then in 1485 completed a Korean law code. Korea adopted a Chinese-style examination system. The system was based on the Confucian classics, but with somewhat different results. The exams were given in Chinese, a foreign language in Korea. This limited the variety of exam candidates to the sons of wealthy aristocrats, the only members of society that could afford to take the time to learn Chinese. While in China, the exam system operated as a mechanism to improve one's status. In Korea, it operated to ensure that the country would continue to be ruled by the same families for centuries. The Yi developed an additional exam system separate from the civil service exam, required for all military officials, although neither exam dealt with practical aspects of government or military service. Candidates of the exam system attended public and then private schools where they were educated in Chinese and the Confucian classics. Every 3 years, graduates had the opportunity to take lower-level exams, which focused on Chinese literature and art. Only about 100 passed and received the degree of Chinsa, Yangban in Korea, becoming members of the gentry. They also received the opportunity to study at the National University for the higher examination. The final examination resulted in only 33 candidates that were eligible for court rank and government post. The Yi class system. As in China, the Korean gentry became the dominant landholders in the country. Land ownership provided increased status and wealth. Many families received large land grants from Yi Song-gi and successive rulers. Most of the country was divided into Yangban estates as the new aristocracy became much larger than the preceding Koryo aristocracy. Chongan, or middle people, made up a smaller and less defined class of people below the Yangban in Korean society. They were primarily lesser government workers and lower-level technicians, yet still members of the privileged hereditary group. Young men made up the majority of the population and were the lower classes. It was primarily made up of peasants and manual laborers who lived as serfs. Unlike previous governments, the Yi did attempt to relieve burdens on the peasantry by attempting to tax according to proportions of productivity and guaranteeing rights to land, but most of these provisions were ignored. At the bottom of the social strata was the Chanmen, or base people, or slaves. These people were primarily industrial workers, miners, butchers, leather workers, actors, and lower-class courtesans, like the Chinese flower boat women and the Japanese geisha. Korea's social system had been criticized for being more rigid than medieval Europe and even India's caste system. It was not only based on birth, but society offered no way for individuals or groups to escape or improve their status. While the number of aristocrats did increase from courtier times, the majority of the population remained impoverished and tied to virtual serfdom or actual slavery. There was little room in Yi society for merchants. A new emphasis on Confucian thought further rejected them from society. Manufacturing was limited to producing luxury goods for the aristocracy and was operated by the government with slave labor. Much more is known about the non-elite world of common people in China than in Korea. This is partly because China's interpretation of Confucianism stressed government's need to serve the people, including the masses. This main aspect of Confucianism seems to have been neglected by Korea when adopting the philosophy from China. Like Ming China, Ying Korea had problems with Japanese piracy. Yi Song-yi was successful in solving this problem, but it re-emerged during the following century. Chinese remained the language for government and the elite, but in 1443, scholars led by King Sejong developed the Korean Hangul system of written language. It was a phonetic system and allowed for transcribing both Korean and Chinese language. The system is both phonetic and can operate as a syllabary. Weakening of Yi Korea. Yi kings felt obligated to offer the Yangban large grants of land in order to ensure support of government. But over time, this led to a situation where the gentry became as powerful as the king. The Yangban escaped paying taxes and government revenue decreased. The burden of making up for the lost revenue was placed on the peasantry, who responded with increasing rebellion and banditry. King Sejong, 1455 to 1468. Tried to reform the system by re-evaluating Yangban estates and trying to check the group's power. Yangban opposition defeated the reform and the country became increasingly factionalized. First, the gentry opposed the king and then each other, including members of the censorate who also aimed to check Yangban authority. Regional Yangban factions emerged. Opposing factions emerged, disappeared, and new ones emerged. By the end of the 16th century, Korea's government was split into two opposing factions, the Easterners and the Westerners, named for the sole districts where members of each lived. The Easterners became victorious only to split into the Northerners and the Southerners. The Northerners overtook their opponent only then to split into the great and the small factions. With the government tied up in internal fighting, the Japanese warlord Hideyoshi invaded the country in 1592. Ming China sent military aid and fought against the Japanese land forces. A Korean admiral, Yi Sun-sen, developed and built the first armored naval warships and fought against the Japanese fleet. Hideyoshi died in 1598 and the Japanese retreated, but Korea never fully recovered from the devastation of the conflict. When Yi Sun-sen died in the battle at Noryang, the Korean government's decline increased as more factionalism emerged. The Manchus of Manchuria invaded Korea in 1627 and again in 1636 and 1637, forcing the Yi to shift their allegiance from the Ming to the Qing right before the later conquered China. The reigns of Yongzhou, 1724 to 1776, and Changzhou from 1776 to 1800 were strong. Yongzhou declared a truce among factions. The five-camp system was put into place during the years of war. A cultural flowering took place in this period, while the devastation of Hideyoshi's invasion was repaired. The Korean population grew from 5 million in 1669 to 9 million in the late 1700s. Artisans who had been kept as servants to the court and nobility were freed and began to produce goods for a general market that had emerged. Merchants gained new status and success with the lessening of earlier restrictions and Confucian resentments. Trade occurred with both China and Japan during this period. Taxes were increasingly made through cash payments, which also indicated an improved economy. The rigid class system described earlier began to become less rigid. More and more people achieved Yangban status. By the mid-19th century, about 50% of the Korean population claimed to be members of the gentry. The government began selling class status and official posts to merchants. Farmers held on to Yangban heritages. Sons of Yangban second wives were supposed to be exempt from taking the exams and becoming gentry, but many successfully fought against this policy. Former slaves escaped their lowly class status and joined the new volunteer army. Western knowledge, or practical learning, stimulated intellectual work, leading to calls for reform. Tribute missions to Beijing, where Jesuit missionaries were in residence, into contact with the West and its culture. In 1795, a Chinese Jesuit convert, Zhou Wenmu, visited Korea as a missionary. Christianity quickly became persecuted by the Korean government due to its opposition to parts of Confucianism, but the new religion spread in secret with the help of Chinese and later French missionaries. Many Korean intellectuals embraced new Western ideas about government reform, science, technology, and greater social equality. After the deaths of Yongzhou and Chongzhou, the country again divided into warring factions, and was further plagued by famine, disease, banditry, and peasant uprisings. Eventually the country fell victim to Japan yet again and was taken over by the country in 1895.